Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, 43b, second line. Obviously, we're still talking about Hegel. So, Amar Rav Achai. Rav Achai says, Hilkach, therefore, so we just mentioned a concept that when you put something on the altar and the fire got a hold of it, started burning it, becomes like the bread of the altar, and therefore if it comes down, you got to put it back up. So based off that, says Rav Achai, Hilkach hayi kometz pigol gepalge makasara upalge askia maracha umashla b'haor masik nalei lekule lechatchila. Let's say you have a offering, let's say a flour offering, and half of it, then you put the whole thing on the altar, and half of it, came off. Well, because you view them as one unit, and this one unit, part of it already started burning, so then the whole thing is considered holy, and you have to go and put the rest of it, even the part that fell off, that came off of the altar, you got to put it back onto the altar. Since we just learned that once it starts burning, it becomes like the bread of the altar. So now you have to go and put the other part on if it came off. Okay. So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, hapigol v'hanos v'hatame. The prohibitions, the invalidations of pigol, things that have the invalid thoughts. V'hanosar, things that were left overnight. You only have 1 day and 1 night to eat your sacrifice, and you left it over past that time. That's no sar, it's left over. V'hatame, and if either and the offering is tame, so all these things are invalid. However, shehelon legabe mizbeach paka isser mehan. Cryptic statement. Now I have to figure out what it means. All these things, these invalidations, if you put it on the altar, then its invalidation flies away. It leaves it. So what does that mean? How does it leave it? So Amar of Chista Mari, the Chimizbeach mikvah tahara. What does that mean? Is the altar a mikvah that purifies? What does that mean? Something's invalid and you put on the altar, now all of a sudden it becomes pure. How does that work? So Amar Zeira she mashla bahan haor. We're talking about a case that once the fire starts burning it, so now it's it'll change statuses. Now it's going to be, so to speak, it's going to belong to the altar. So let's see more about this. So how does that work? How exactly is that going to work? That sounds like even though it's impure, but once it goes onto the altar and it starts burning, so now it becomes the altar's, and the prohibition leaves. So let's see. Masiv Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna says, Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna, I have a question on you from the following brisa. Acherim Omrim, and we're going to go more into this verse at the bottom of the page. It says v'tumaso alav. It says by the section of the Torah talking about eating the meat of the sacrifices in a state of impurity. It says v'tumaso alav. It's only somebody who's impure. So if he eats it, and the brisa expound v'tumaso alav mishetuma porachas mimenu. It sounds like the invalidation of impurity of a person being impure and then eating something holy, which is not supposed to do, is talking about something which it's possible for the impurity to leave him. If he has a state of impurity, we'll see more about this, that the impurity is able to leave him, and then when he eats the holy sacrifices, then it's going to be a problem. What's that coming to exclude? Yatsa basar she'ein tuma porachas mimenu. Excluding meat, which once the meat becomes impure, it can't go away. It's there forever. Now, if that's true, in Isa, if you, Rabbi Zeira, just told me that once something in a state of impurity is put onto the altar, its impurity goes away. So according to Acherim in this brisa, they clearly state not that way. They said it's only somebody whose impurity is able to leave him, let's say by a person, he can go to the mikvah, and yet he remains in a state of impurity and eats the meat, then it's going to be an invalidation. But meat itself, there's no way to get rid of that impurity. You can't put into the mikvah. So therefore, that's going to be excluded from the prohibition. It'll still probably be an invalidation. You can't bring up an impure offering, but it sounds like eating that meat is going to be of a different status. So Rava wants to defend Rabbi Zera, and Rava says, Rava al yedei mikvah kamrinan. So Rava says that really the Brisa is talking about things that are possible that you could become pure through the mikvah. So there it says that meat is excluded, but it never said that meat could never become pure. It just was talking about cases that you can become pure through going to the mikvah. Obviously, meat cannot go to the mikvah, but maybe if you were to put the impure meat onto the altar and the altar would get a hold of it and start burning it, maybe that would remove its impure status. So it says the Gemara, Midin mikvah ksiv. This brisa that talks about a person being impure, excluding meat that's impure, has no reference to a mikvah. So it sounds like it was general on purpose. It's only somebody who the impurity could leave him, excluding meat, which impurity can never leave them. And it didn't limit this impurity leaving, the purifying to a mikvah. So it sounds like in meat, the impurity could never leave. And the question on Rabbi Zera remains. What did you mean that if the altar if it started burning it, that the impurity leaves? We see a brisa not that way. So Ella Amar Rav Papa says, so we're not going to add the words mikvah to it, but maybe we're talking about the basar shlomim askina. Basar shlomim, the meat of a peace offering, below chazila hakrava, is not fitting for full consumption. The altar doesn't fully consume the meat of a shlomim, because part of it goes to the altar and part of it goes to a person. So therefore, since we're talking that brisa that says the tumaso alav is talking about cases that are sounds like according to Ravina, according to Rav Papa, we're talking about basar shlamim. Basar shlamim is not fit to be brought up on the altar, because part of it it gets eaten. So maybe that's what that brisa was talking about. But it's still possible that any offering which meat is fully consumed on the altar, if that meat is in a state of impurity and you put it on the altar and the altar starts burning it, maybe the impurity will go away. We're talking about a case of a shlamim, a peace offering that is not fully consumed on the altar. Therefore, it's not necessarily an attack on Rabbi Zera. So it's another way to defend him. Ravina says, the tumaso alav. The tumaso alav, mi shetuma parachas imenu kishehu shalem. Yatsa basar, davar she'ein tuma parachas kishehu shalem, ella kishehu chaser. Ravina is saying that the difference between the person becoming impure is that when he is whole, meaning when he's all in one state, one person, he can go to the mikvah and he'll become pure. But the meat is never in its full state. It always gets part of the animal removed. All you have is part of the meat that's going to get consumed. So it's always only a part of the animal, and therefore the Bryce is saying that we're excluding something which cannot be purified in its whole state. It's only purified in its fractured state, in its fragmented state. Yeah. So therefore, once again, it's still not necessarily an attack on Ravina, because maybe at the end of the day, if this meat is impure, by putting it onto the altar and it starts burning it, the impurity could go away. Okay, now back to this brisa that we brought as an attack on Rabbi Zera. Now we're going to analyze it. So the brisa is quoting a verse from the 7th chapter of Vayikra, which is talking about a person touching meat in a state of impurity, and that you have to then burn the meat of the sacrifices, and you should not eat the meat if you're in a state of impurity. So the words we're going to see, impurity is going to mean what? Is it going to mean that the person is impure, or is it going to mean that the meat is impure? Right, we have two permutations. The person's impure and the meat is pure. The person's pure and the meat is impure. Is it referring to one of them or is it referring to both of them? So how do we know? Let's see. Gufa. Go back to the text itself. The tumaso Allah. So it says, and the tumah is upon him. It says the Gemara, first thought you would have think, upon him. The tumas haguf akasim medaber. It's talking about the person who's impure. Ata omer betumas haguf ein ela betumas basar. You're telling me it's referring to the impurity of the person. Maybe it's referring to the impurity of the meat. It says the Gemara, we're going to do a Gzeira Shava from somebody that goes into the temple without realizing in a state of impurity. And there it's clearly referring to the person, not the meat. So, Namar Khan Tumaso, and Namar Lahalan Tumaso, both. Malahalan Betumasago. Over there, when you're walking into the temple in a state of impurity, clearly it says Tumaso, it's referring to the person in a state of impurity. So, Malahalan Tumasago, Akasim Medaber, Afkan, so to here, Betumasaguf, Hakasim Medaber. So to here in our verse, we're talking about somebody who is in a state of impurity. And that person who eats the meat is in trouble. So, Rabbi Yossi Omer, another way to learn this out, Hoil v'nemru kachim b'loshen rabim. Right? We always refer to the sacrifice, not always. We sometimes refer to the sacrifices, at least in this case, in the plural. So we're here. It's probably referring to, we call it a shlomim. In this verse itself, it talks about the shlomim. Shlomim is in the plural. The yud mem at the end of shlomim is always used for the plural, right? And Hashim, people, always the yud mem makes it plural. So Rabbi Yossi says it's referring to sacrifices in the plural, shlomim. Hoil v'nemru kachim b'loshen rabim in the plural. V'nemra tuma b'loshen yachid. But when it comes to impurity, it uses the singular language. It doesn't use the plural language. Tamei doesn't say tmeim. So the tumas haguf akasim medaber. So it says Rabbi Yossi, it's very understandable that it's referring to the person, because if it was referring to the meat, it should have used the same plural language, but instead it used a singular language to as a reference to the person becoming impure and not the meat itself. Okay. Rabbi Omer, Rabbi says that a few verses later, it says v'achal, and he ate. So that's referring to, so now this is already 8 verses later in the 21st verse of the 7th chapter, not the verse that we were talking about. Oh, sorry, it's the next verse. We were talking about the 19th and 20th verses. This is verse 21. And it says, v'achal mi basar es tevach, a person goes and eats. So clearly, the achal is it sounds like the person's in the state of impurity and he eats. The achal, so that's referring to the person. The tumas haguf hakasim medaber. So 3 opinions seem to all be agreeing that the tuma in this section, the impurity, is referring to the tuma of the person and not the tuma of the meat. Okay. And then here comes this part that we quoted earlier. Achirim amru. Others say, usually it's Rav Meir, right? Rav Meir right. Achirim amru. V'tumaso alav misha tuma parakasinenu yatsa basar she'ein tuma parakasinenu. And then the Bryce ends off. The tumaso alav, as referring to when the tuma is upon him, meaning it's referring to somebody that the impurity could leave him, and yet it remains, as opposed to the meat, where the tumah will not leave him, cannot leave him, and therefore that's going to be excluded. Yeah, but tumas Allah sounds like, and he's still in the state of impurity. What do you mean still in the state of impurity? It means that he could have purified himself, and he still remains in a state of impurity. So such a person who eats the meat is going to be it's going to be over the violation, as opposed to the meat in a state of impurity cannot become purified. And how does that fit with earlier that we had a few answers? Exactly what is this part of the Brisa talking about? So, okay, fine. Amar Mar. So back to the third opinion in this Brisa that taught us that the Brisa is referring to the person being impure. That was Rebbe. Rebbe said that the next verse said v'achal, going on the person. So it sounds like we're talking about the person. So just like it spoke about the person eating, it sounds like the context is referring to the person becoming impure. Yeah. So now we're going to figure out exactly where did Rebbe see it. Meaning, it sounds like all the verse said is then he ate it. So he ate it could mean one of two things. He ate it when he was in a state of impurity, or he ate it while it was in a state of impurity. The fact that it says v'achal, that he ate it, doesn't tell you necessarily that he's a state of. So how does that next verse show you that the first verse was talking about his own impurity, not the impurity of the meat? So let's see. Amar Mar, Rebbe Omer v'achal b'tumas across medaber. That the verse, this is showing you that the previous verses were talking about a person in a state of impurity. Says the Gemara, Ma'i mashma. From where does the word "and he will eat" teach you that? So Amar Rava says, interesting statement. Kol kra dilo mefarish leRabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi. Any verse that's not explained to me by Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi, or any brisa of a chol masnisa dilo mefarsha la Rav Zeiri. So lo mefarsha. Lo mefarsha. So I don't know the explanation. Meaning, unless they explain it to me, I don't have an explanation. Sounds like they were the experts in the psukim and in the mishnayos and the brisos. So therefore, Haki Amar Avudimi. Sorry, Haki Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi. So Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi said the following: Hoil upasak akasa b'lashon nekeva. The verse started off using the feminine language. Yeah. So what was that? That was the nefesh. Yeah, it says I think v'nichrasa hanefesh, meaning that the soul will be cut off, is in the feminine. It doesn't say v'nichras hanefesh, it's v'nichrasa. So meaning the soul is referred to in the feminine. So it starts off in the feminine. V'sayim b'lashon nekeva, and it ends off also v'nichrasa hanefesh in the feminine. V'lashon zachar be'emtza, but in the middle, when it refers to v'achal, talking about the person, the achal is in the masculine. So that discrepancy teaches you that the tumah sagava custom medaber, that the verse is referring to the tumah of the person. The fact that it starts and ends in a feminine language, but in the middle it has a masculine language, teaches you that we're talking about the impurity of the person himself. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Fine. So Masnisa. Okay. So now Masnisa is referring to the brisa. So now the Tanya. Okay. So this is a little bit of the next section. Masnisa, the Tanya says the brisa the following: we're going to have different states of impurity and different levels of severity of the foods that are eaten. So you can't eat the meiser when you're in a state of impurity. You can't eat the truma when you're in a state of impurity. So we have different levels of impurity and different levels of food that you eat when you're in that state of impurity. So let's see. The brisa said, Im nemru kalos, lama nemru chamuros. Im nemru chamuros, lama nemru kalos. So it's going to be very vague, and we're going to try to fill in the blank soon. If you said the light ones, so why say the strict ones? If you say the strict ones, why say the light ones? So says the Gemara, Im nemru kalos, if I only had the strict the lenient prohibitions, we'll see what that is in a second, and not the strict ones, I would have come to the following erroneous conclusion. Hayisi omer ala kalos bilav, ala chamuros b'misa. The lighter prohibitions are only going to be a negative violation, a negative commandment, and the stricter prohibitions are going to be with death. Lekach nemru chamuros. That's why I specify that it's not just the lighter ones, it's even the chamuros to teach you that those also will only get you a negative prohibition. And vice versa. If I only had the strict ones, I didn't have the lighter ones. So below nemru kalos, ayisi omer ala chamuros yechayev ala kalos yepater. You'd have thought for the strict ones you're going to be liable, and for the lighter ones you're going to be exempt. Lekach nemru kalos. Therefore, I mentioned the kalos, the lighter ones, to teach you that you're not exempt and you are and you have violated the prohibition. Okay, so some kind of kalos and chamuros, lighter and stricter, and each one we have a question why you mention it. So the first part of the brisa told us that I would have thought if I only mentioned the light ones, it would be a negative commandment, but the strict ones would be with death, to which I mentioned the strict ones, the teacher that they're actually lighter also, only a negative commandment. And the other way, the brisa says is that if I didn't teach you the lighter ones, you thought that you're exempt. I taught you to teach you that you're liable also. So what are we talking about? Mai kalos umai chamuros. What exactly are the lighter ones, so to speak, and what exactly are the stricter ones? So, yeah, ilema kalos meiser and chamuros truma. So let's say we're talking about you're in a state of impurity, and you are going to now eat meiser, the tithes, which is improper. And chamuros is referring to truma. It's more strict. It's referring to truma. So now, what would you have thought? You would have thought that maybe truma will get you misa, death, to which the brisa implies that no, it only gets you negative prohibition. It says the Gemara, Hayisi omer b'misa. What do you mean you would have thought you get death for eating truma in a state of impurity? Habamisa, hashanami habamisa. You do get death for it, so that doesn't make sense. We need something that you would have thought has a death penalty, and then it doesn't. But this does have a death penalty. Truma in a state of impurity has a death penalty, death by the hands of heaven. So the su, and furthermore, the ilo namru, hayisi omer b'misa. And also, what if if I didn't teach you that, you would have thought you would get the death penalty? How? If you only had the lighter ones, which gets you a negative commandment, meaning if you only know that if you eat meiser, you get a negative commandment, and you would learn out truma from meiser, so how would you get that truma gives you death? You can't, whenever you learn a kal v'chomer from somewhere, you can't be stricter than your teacher. Meaning, if all you have by meiser is a negative commandment, and that's teaching you to truma that there's a violation, it can't teach you more than a negative commandment. You can't learn that meiser gives you a negative commandment, and eating truma in a state of impurity teaches you death. You can't do that. That's called dayo. Enough. Dayo lavo min adin lios kinido. Okay, so this idea that the words light and strict, lenient and strict, are referring to meiser truma gets rejected. So what is it referring to? Maybe it's not referring to the food that you eat, but it's referring to the state of impurity that you're in. Ela kalos is going to be tumas sheretz, and chamuros is going to be tumas meis. When it says lighter versus stricter, it's referring to the impurity by one of the insects, and the stricter impurity was going to be the impurity of touching a corpse. So it says the Gemara, okay, so we now nail down what does lighter and more strict mean, but what are you eating in a state of impurity? In these two states of impurity, what are you eating, meiser or truma? It says the Gemara, ubemai. Truma, if you're eating truma, edi b'misa, hu b'misa, is death in the hands of heaven for both of them. and yet the Bryce implies there's some case that you would have got only a negative commandment, and not meaning lashes, and not death. V'su, and furthermore, lekach namru chamuros. Therefore, you have to teach me the stricter ones, because you would have thought that you wouldn't get death. It says the Gemara, you don't need that. The belav hachi b'misahi. Anyways, we know if you eat the truma in a state of impurity, that one would get death. So if that's what it's talking about, it doesn't make sense. The iba achilas meiser, maybe they're talking about two kinds of impurity, two states of impurity, and we're talking about the eating of meiser. So now, how did it play out in the brisa? On the next page, imlo namru chamuros. If you never would have taught the chamuros, hayisi omer ala chamuros b'misa. You would have thought that the stricter ones, meaning if you were contaminated by a corpse, you would have thought that eating meiser would get you death. To which he told you, no, only gets you negative commandment. Well, let's see if that's true. Once again, how would you know that if you touched a corpse and you ate meiser, you did something wrong? You would learn from the fact that when you touch an insect that's impure and you eat meiser, you do something wrong. But that is only going to be a negative commandment. So you can't learn from the fact that you're impure because you touched an insect and now you ate meiser and you've only committed a negative prohibition. You can't learn from there that if I'm in a stricter state of impurity, such as touching a corpse, that and now I eat meiser, I'll get death, because you can't have more than what your teacher taught you. So if you're learning from Tumas Sheretz, and there it's only a lav, a negative prohibition, it's called dayo. You can't, with the Kal V'chomer, learn to stricter impurity, a stricter punishment. Doesn't work that way. Okay, so what are we talking about? Amar Ze'iri, kalos Tumas Sheretz. When it said kalos, it was referring to a lower state of impurity, such as touching one of the insects. Chamuros, stricter, that's referring to Tumas Meis. That's referring to coming in contact with a corpse. And this is what it means to say, V'hachi kama. Ilu namar Tumas Sheretz. If I only would have taught that being in a state of impurity, because I touched one of the insects, Ilu namar Tumas Sheretz. V'namar meiser v'truma, and it taught me that I cannot eat meiser or truma in a state of that impurity. Below namar Tumas Meis. But it never taught me what would happen if I would eat those things when I was in a state of a higher level of impurity, such as I came in contact with a corpse. Hayisi Omer, I would have said the following conclusion. It gets a little, if you have a chart, it's easier. Yeah. So what would I have thought? Remember, so we have four things here. We have Tumas Sheretz, which is a lighter state of impurity. We have meiser and truma. Meiser is more lenient than truma. Truma is more strict than meiser. So that's one section. Then you have what's the unknown, what would have been the unknown if the Torah didn't tell us. Eating trumas and meiser and truma in a state of a higher level of impurity by touching a corpse, meiser and truma. So what would you have thought if you never taught me what would be in a state of impurity, of a high level of impurity? I would have come to the following erroneous conclusion, to which I had to teach you what happens when you touch a corpse and you eat these things. So, Hayisi Omer, kalos al kalos bilav. So put the two together. The lower state of impurity, I mean the one that you touched, the sheretz, al kalos, by eating meiser, which is also more lenient, bilav gets you a negative commandment. The ala chamuros b'misa. But if I would eat truma in that same lower state of impurity, I would get death. So now, umidekalos al chamuros b'misa, just like my lower state of impurity, eating the more strict food, such as truma, gets me death, gets a person death. Chamuros nami al kalos b'misa. I would have thought that if I'm in a higher state of impurity, such as touching a corpse, if I eat meiser, a person would get death. That's what you could have thought. The lighter state of impurity, eating the more strict food, gets death. So to the higher state of impurity, eating the lighter food should also get death. Lekach namru chamuros. That's why it taught me that I don't get death. Rather, I only get a Therefore, it taught me that when I'm in a lighter state of impurity, if I eat truma, a person would only get a negative commandment and not death, I believe. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Next part of the Mishnah. Next part of the Mishnah. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Next part of the Mishnah. So we said that our Mishnah talked about all the cases that you don't get pigul. So the difference is something called the permitter, the matir. When you have something which permits something else, classically, blood thrown onto the altar now permits consumption of meat, either by the altar or by the person, which is in direct contrast to a flour offering, where the flour itself is what you scoop up, is what you put onto the altar. It's not permitting anything. It's just you take it and you put it on the altar. So that's not permitting anything, and therefore it's excluded from the kares punishment. It's still going to be prohibited. It's still an invalidation, but not at the same degree. So now we're going to find out, how do you know that? So now, Tanur Rabbanan. Sounds like a little bit in the middle. Oh, Eino maybe Ella Kayotze Bishlamim. So the section of pigul is spoken about in reference to the peace offering, right? And the question is it limited to the peace offering, or does it expand to anything which is similar to the peace offering, but not limited to it? So let's see. Tanur Rabbanan, the whole idea of pigul is only by a shlamim, so maybe it should only apply to things like a shlamim. Maybe a shlamim has, you have 2 days and 1 night to eat it. So maybe pigul is limited to where it's mentioned, to a shlamim. So only sacrifices that have, we'll see, like a bechor, firstborn, that only have 2 days and 1 night, only there are you liable for pigul. How do you know? How do you know that offerings that you have less time to consume them, 1 day and 1 night, it's also liable pigul? Talmud lomar mi basar. From the word mi basar, from the meat. I guess it's an extra word. Yeah. Yeah. So from the meat of the offering, sounds like not only by a shlamim, it comes to include other meats too. So mi basar, kol shirayin nechal, anything which its leftovers are eaten, meaning any meat that is eaten is included in that in the prohibition of pigul. So says the word, that's very good for shlamim. It says it in shlamim. Any other meat that's going to be eaten, it'll apply there. In ola, a fully consumed offering, nothing's eaten. How do I know that an ola offering, which is not eaten, it's fully consumed on the altar? How do I know that that is something which is also liable for pigul? Talmud lomar zevach. It says the word zevach. It says the word zevach. Okay. Sounds like that's extra. Maybe we'll see. Okay. Fine. Fine. That's all that. Now, minayin l'rabos. How do I know to include the bird offerings and the flower offerings? Minayin l'rabos opus v'haminachos. How do I know to include them? Ad shani mar belog shemen shel mitzora. Until I come to include even the oil of the mitzora. Right, so the mitzora at the end of its purification process has to bring a asham offering, and then you sprinkle the blood on his right finger, the right toe, the right ear, and then I think you also you pour a little bit of oil, I think, on his hand, and then you sprinkle it onto the altar, I believe. So how do you know that pigul applies to there also? Talmud lomar asher heim makdishim li. Now this verse is in reference to the eating of the holy sacrifices, that you cannot eat them in a state of you can't profane them. So what does that have to do with pigul? That's in a whole different section. That's 15 chapters later. Says the Gemara like this: Va'asi nosar chilul mitoma, va'asi pigul avon minosar. So we learn the prohibition of that the offering can't be nosar from the fact that it says chilul chilul. It says you cannot eat it in a state of impurity. Gzeir shava to nosar. Then va'asi pigul avon minosar, and then pigul is learned out of a gzeir shava from nosar. So you have a double gzeir shava that you learn out that just like if you're in a state of impurity, it's called profaning when you eat the offering in a state of impurity, profaning it. Then you learn out gzeir shava to nosar. If you leave it overnight, that's also going to profane it. And now you learn from nosar to pigul that other things that all these other things are also included in the pigul prohibition. Okay. At the end of the day, what you just tell me, basically pigul comes to include everything. So why did you specify it by a shlamim offering? Meaning, what's unique to a shlamim that pigul is mentioned there if it's just going to end up referring to all offerings? So it says the Gemara, no, for one thing. Lama nemar shlamim. When the Torah said pigul, why did it say, by a shlamim? Well, nothing is unique about a shlamim, a peace offering. It refers to everything. So me'ata, lama nemar shlamim me'ata, lomar lach, ma shlamim miyuchad sheyesh lahen matirin, bein la'adam bein l'mizbeach, av kol sheyesh la matirin, bein la'adam bein l'mizbeach, chayavin alehen mishum pigul. It's coming to teach you what is unique about a shlamim, that it is something which, when you throw the blood, now you can consume the meat on the altar and consume the meat for consumption. So it's something that has a permitter. I guess one could have asked, other offerings also have permitters. You could have stated over there. I'm thinking now, but maybe it's unique because it has a permitter for both, for consumption of the altar and consumption of a human being. So if you had, let's say, like an ola offering, you would have only known that it's only food that's consumed on the meat that's consumed on the altar, but not by a person. But shlamim has both. And now the Gemara just quotes our Mishnah, which shows you this. So in ola, dama matir is besara. This is just a quote from the Mishnah. The ola offering, the blood, permits the meat to the mizbeach, the over the kohanim, and its skin to the kohanim. Ola sa'of, dama matir is besara lemizbeach. The ola, the bird ola offering, the blood permits the meat to the altar. Chata sa'of, the bird sin offering, dama matir as besara lekohanim. The blood permits the meat for the kohanim. Harim hanisrafim, the bulls that are burnt. Usiir hanisrafim, and the he-goats that are burnt. Dama matir, I say mirein likarid. The blood permits the throwing of the blood permits the other sacrificial parts of the animal to be brought up, and that's all. All of these are permitters. You see what the idea of a permitter is? It permits something else to happen, and that's coming to exclude the parts in our Mishnah. Umotziani as hakomitz. The flour, vasalavona, and putting on the frankincense, it doesn't come to permit anything. You just take it and put it on the altar. Vakitores and the ketores, special spices they used to bring. Quite a fancy word for it. Uminchas kohanim, uminchas kohen mashiach, uminchas mesachim v'adam. This is all the Mishnah, the different flour offerings of the kohanim, of the kohen gadol, of the different libations, the hadam, and the blood, which I still have to figure out what that means. Rabbi Shimon Omer. So that's all the first opinion. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon is the unique opinion. He says that no, the reason why the Torah said pigul by shlamim is for the following. Ma shlamim miyuchadim sheish bo ala mizbeach hachitza. Shlamim is unique because it's brought on the outer altar v'chayav and alav, and you're liable for pigul. Av kol sheish ala mizbeach hachitza and chayav and alav. Mishum pigul. Anything which is brought on the outer altar, you'll be liable for pigul. Coming to exclude Yalsa Parman and Sofim, Basir Man and Sofim. The bulls that are fully burnt and the he-goats that are fully burnt, Hoel She'ain Ala Mizbeach Yitzon Kishlamim, those are not brought on the outer altar, like the Shlamim. Therefore, you're not chayiv, a person not chayiv pigul for them. Says 1 minute, I guess. Amar Mar, What's similar to a shlamim? We said that something similar to a shlamim. What is that? Ma'inihu bechor. A bechor is that which is similar to a shlamim. Dinechal l'shnei yamim v'layla echad. Says the Gemara, how would you know to apply a pigel from a shlamim to a bechor? No, I guess we'll stop here. It'll take us right full back. Give it a few minutes. Good.